welcome. Thank you for joining us for Israelis Head to the Polls, Israel's 2026 elections. This is our three-part educational series presented by the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington and the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. We're very excited to have you with us, and as we begin what we hope will be a useful and engaging conversation about Israel's upcoming election. Israelis are scheduled to head to the polls on October 27th, and this will be the first national election since the October 7th attacks in 2023. There is obviously a lot happening in Israel right now, and there is no shortage of political news, polling, analysis, speculation. And throughout this series, we will address all of that. But for today, rather than trying to cover everything at once, we wanted to start with the basics and have a conversation between three Israelis, all with different experiences and different perspectives. So before I introduce us all, I just want to note that the views and opinions expressed during today's program and the entire series are those of the individual speakers of our personal opinions, and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, the JCRC, or any other organization that is represented. And with that, today I want to introduce our speakers, including myself, but we'll start with our speakers who are here. We have with us Dean Bagdadi, who is the director of the Jewish Peoplehood Leadership Academy at Kolami. And previously, many of you might recognize him. He served as the senior shliach for the Northern Virginia Jewish community at the Poses JCC. Dean has a background in Israeli politics, community building, and informal education, and is particularly skilled at breaking down complicated political issues and facilitating conversations. Next, we have Hila Kedar. She is the Educational Engagement Shlicha with the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. Hila was born and raised in Jerusalem and has spent much of her career working in community building, civic engagement, and informal education in Israel and around the world. And myself, I'm Odesser. I'm the director of the Dr. Stuart Lessans Israel Action Center here at the JCRC of Greater Washington. I was also born and raised in Jerusalem, and before moving to the United States, I worked in Israel in informal education and community programming. I've also had a long-standing connection to the American Jewish community, spending significant time in the US growing up and working as an Israeli emissary after my military service, both giving me the opportunity to spend a lot of time with American Jewish families and communities and really seeing firsthand the role Israel plays in American Jewish life. So one thing I think is particularly valuable about having the three of us here is that we can all look at this election as average Israelis, but also from slightly different perspectives. We're going to start the conversation today with Dean, who will help us understand how Israeli elections actually work, how the political system functions, what we should be watching as we get closer to the election day. Then we'll turn to Hila, who will take us a little closer to the ground and talk about what this election might mean to the average Israeli, how Israelis are thinking about this election and what is important, this moment looks like from the perspective of the Israeli society. And I'll follow up by talking a bit about the election, what it might mean for us here in the United States, and specifically for the American Jewish community and the U.S.-Israel relationship. So with that, I will turn it over to Dean. We will try to keep things short, relatively 5-10 minutes for each of us, and we will, of course, open it up then for Q&A. So please feel free to, submit questions at any point through the Q&A feature. I will now pass it over to Dean to start us off. Dean, screen is yours.
Toda rabba. Hello from Be'er Sheva. I have to say I was very happy to hear from Adam when he asked if I want to join this panel. It's been a while since my last panel with JCRC. I'm really, really excited. I was excited to do it. I'm really happy to be on the Zoom call. And I think there's no better way to do it than to talk about Israeli politics. Yes, so to start us off, I was requested to give a bit of a breakdown to both how the parliamentarian democracy of Israel works, compares to the US, and then specifically about the chronology of the elections. And I'll also say I dressed really nicely for you guys, and it's August right now in Be'er Sheva, and I'm not accommodated to the weather. So that should be appreciated. But the standard of a JCRC Zoom is something that I respect, and therefore dressed up. And so starting with Israel's democratic system in general, same as the US, there's the balances between the different institution, right? The government, the parliament or the Knesset for us, and then the Supreme Court. And in Israel, different from the US, everything both for the government and the parliament is voted by single elections. Those are the elections that are coming in. In the US, the government is comprised of secretaries that are elected by the elected president. And in Israel, those are all serving parliament members, Knesset members, that are elected through the official elections and then through the coalition's agreement. And if we go through the chronology of the elections itself, we're starting off by, let's say, setting up in 2 weeks from now, which is where we have our final lists served into the Knesset, and those are the lists that should be for the run when the election started on the designated date, which is October 27th. Now, if we're looking at the elections in general, you can say that they are relative, national, and for a party. Relative means that the general sum of vote determined specifically how many votes, how many actual ballots you need in order to get a seat in the Knesset. You have to pass a certain threshold that is 3.25%, or 4 seats out of 120 that are eventually counted at the end of the election day. That what refers to as relative, because that means that at the end of the day, if a certain party ran for election and didn't pass the threshold, all those votes are being cast aside and don't count. So you have to vote for a party that you believe will pass the threshold, not just any party. Another difference in that aspect is that Israel has more than 30, even 40 parties running for each elections, compared to 3 or 4 parties in the US when you look at serving members at the end of the day. The second aspect of the Israeli election, besides relative, is national. Israel has one district that is the entire country that everybody is voting for. And the third one is for a party and not for a serving member. And that means that in difference from the US, where you vote for your county's representative or your congressman that represents your county or your area of voting, in Israel, it's all just one big voting area. And you don't vote for one person, you vote for a list. Some of those lists are determined by the chairperson of the party, which is always going to be who's number one on the list, the front foremost. But some of them have premier elections. The Likud is one of them, and some other parties that haven't done before. The Labour Party, Avoda, also does that. Meretz too. And by that I mean that at the end of the day, each party has a list of 120 participants that they believe should enter the Knesset as serving members. Each party has a ballot that has the designated letter of that party, and by the number of seats that the party is going to gain after the elections, you go down by that list, and those are the individuals that are going to serve as Knesset members. So for that, let's say you have a party that received 25 seats after the countdown of the elections. Number 1 till number 25 of that list are going to be serving as Knesset members. So in premier elections, those who get the highest voting are going to be in the top list or the top 10 list of each party. And those are usually who would you refer to as the most popular Knesset members in each party, right? So in parties that do have premier elections beforehand, they allowed the registered voters for that party to pick the list itself, or the let's say the order in which each of their designated elected officials should be running for. A party that usually gets a lower number of votes take more seriously the top 10 list, and parties that usually receive between 10 and 20 or even 30 votes usually knows that those top 30 on the list are going to be the elected officials in the. So this is how the elections are comprised in general. That means that Israelis, the average Israeli citizen, when when that happens, that doesn't happen frequently, vote every 4 years. In recent history, besides that specific Knesset, we voted for a shorter period of time, but usually it means that your only ability to change or to modify what is happening in the Knesset as an individual, as a citizen, is through voting for the Knesset. That determines who are the parliament member or the Knesset members. That determines the coalition, the government, the prime minister, and other aspects as well. Now, specifically for our voting process, the way it works is, as I mentioned earlier, the countdown for closing down the list and giving the final approval on who is running is in 2 weeks from now. And that means that if certain parties know that they're not going to pass the threshold by themselves, usually join other parties. And another aspect of that is that they also have something that's called the Skem She'erim in Hebrew, or let's call it leftovers for that matter. And that means that if some of them receive, let's say, half of the amount of seats necessary above the threshold, above a certain number of seats, let's say I received the equivalent number of voting for 4.5 seats, for an example, and now the party received the same, they should count those votes together, even if they're not running together. These are some of the, let's call it the tricks that some parties know how to use, other than joining other parties to become a larger party. That's the difference between a miflaga and a si'ah in Israel. But that will be the designated date, the final date for serving the final list that includes both which parties are running and their list of participants, numbers included. After those lists are being served, our next, let's say, point of time will be election day itself, October 27th. That starts from the morning to the evening, close down at 10 p.m. And then the counting begins of the votes. Israeli voting system is very old-fashioned, and we'll talk more about it. I think Hila is going to address it when she refers to the cultural side of it and the political side of it. But that means that they're spending the entire night counting all of the votes, all of the ballots, registering them, and then determining the final number of votes that are eligible. Some votes are being disqualified for fraud, in a sense, or other types of trying to manipulate the total number of ballots. But essentially, that total sum of voting ballots then is distributed between the different parties, determining how many seats they get. Each party that doesn't pass the threshold is being disqualified, and then those votes are not being counted for the total number of votes. It's a bit complicated, but we'll probably address it more as we continue with the panel. And after voting counted, we're moving into the more interesting part of elections, which is the establishment of a coalition. In order to establish a government in Israel, you need 61 votes. And that means you, as a leader of a party, start to reach out to all of the other parties, the chairperson of the other parties and other Knesset members, and convince them why you should be the head of their coalition. A major part of that includes both what seats are they going to get serving as ministers, what ministries they're going to get, which allows them to have influence and more ability to gain whatever they promised for their voters, who's going to be the Minister of Treasury, who's going to be the Minister of Security, and etc. And the other thing is distribution of many of the financial abilities that coalition agreements have, which is also something that is addressed at these elections. So after establishing a coalition, all of the chairperson goes to the president, and he gives permission or the mandate for the person who has the most chances to establish a coalition his first go of getting those 61 votes. After that has been passed aside, and we've seen in recent elections where that didn't go well for round one, and then it continues to round two, round three, until someone has a coalition. After that, there is the official voting for the government, and then you seal both the Knesset and the government for the next 4 years to come. That is as quickest as I could go addressing that complicated procedure or process. And now I'm going to transition it to Hila to give more of a breakdown about the cultural aspects of it and other aspects.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you for this explanation. I got it everything for 10 minutes. Now I know much better how it works. So thank you so much. Nice to meet you and nice to see all of you. And thank you for joining. My name is Hila. I'm from the Federation of Greater Washington, and I'm very happy to be here. And today I have only 10 minutes trying to explain to you, what this specific election is going to look like for, the average Israeli and how we see it as Israelis. So it's a bit challenging, but I will try my best. And actually, I will want to go from the macro level a bit to the micro level. So first, I want to ask you, try to imagine yourself, if you're Israeli right now, how this coming month or how this election season in Israel is going to look like. So I want to give you a glimpse, a bit of how it's going to look like, and also what makes Israeli elections so different or so unique from other countries. So the first thing, if I'm thinking about, politics and elections in Israel as an Israeli, is that for us, politics is something that we're talking about it a lot. I don't know if you had a political conversation with Israeli, but it's something that most of us are very familiar with. We're talking about it at home, with friends, at work, and we have the Israeli chutzpah to ask everyone, who are you going to vote for? Which is something sometimes in America, you don't always feel comfortable to ask that. And in Israeli, regular conversations, it's pretty much something you're asking, I will say every day, everyone. And sometimes also there is a lot of disagreements. This is something that is pretty normal in Israel society. You can easily have very different political opinions within the same family or within the same group of friends or workplace. And this is something that, it's becoming more and more challenging during these a few years. But this is something pretty normal to have, debate on a shishi dinner with all of your family. One is voting to someone else, to another party, and like the debate is something that is happening kind of in every family. I will say in Israel, but we still keep friends and being, a family. But it's something that pretty much happens a lot, and it's part of everyday conversation. Now, when you go to the streets in Israel, you will probably hear it in every restaurant and in every, I don't know, near the beach. And it's something that we're talking about it a lot generally and specifically during coming this election. The second thing is that I think make Israeli election pretty unique is that the voter turnout is traditionally high. So comparing, for example, to the United States elections for the presidential election, so in the recent years we see like a very high turnout in Israeli election between 65 to 75%, which means that Israeli getting more involved in politics and in the electoral process, and a lot of people do want to vote. And in our last election on 2022, the voter turnout was 70%, which is pretty high, showing how Israelis are willing to take part of this voting process. And there are also some structural reasons that make it much more easier to Israelis to vote. So the first thing is that Israeli citizens who are 18 or older automatically register to vote. It's not like in some countries in the US that you need to do it manually. In Israel, it's automatically. When you become 18, you're eligible to vote. So it's much more easier to do that. The second reason is that the same day of the election, the public transportation is free to make it much more easier to Israeli to go to vote. And then the third reason is that election day in Israel, it's a day off from work. So it's really common that the Israeli on the same day, they go, they will vote, and then they will take, this free public transportation, go to the beach or to the pool or to do something fun. It's kind of, a Shabbat day in Israel. So, didn't talk about it a little bit, but it's a pretty surprisingly that the voting process in Israel, it's pretty old school. So although Israel is a very high-tech country, Israel keeps the voting process surprisingly traditionally. You walk into the polling station, step behind a curtain, pick a paper slip for the party that you want. There is a lot of slips, and then you choose the one you want, put it in an envelope, and drop it into the ballot box. There is no voting machine and no touch screen, just paper and a curtain and the box. So most Israelis living abroad actually cannot vote remotely. They need to come physically to vote in Israel. There are a limited expectation for certain Israelis officials and employees serving abroad, for example, Shlichim, that can vote in designated diplomatic places. But most of the Israeli, if they want to participate and to vote, they need to physically be in Israel. And this is why once the election date was announced this year, a lot of Israeli really quickly bought their flight ticket to Israel, although it was really expensive, but a lot of them did it because they see the importance of being present in Israel during these elections and to be part of that, which is something pretty unique, I will say, for these specific elections, that we see a lot of people coming from abroad, especially to vote. Another thing that Dean also talked about it is 10 p.m. the day of the election. So the polling station generally close at 10 p.m. And then is a really cultural moment in Israel. Every Israeli is sitting in front of the TV. And then we see what we call the midgamim. So the midgamim is it's kind of a statistical projection based on voters leaving the polling station to see pretty much who they're voting for. And within minutes, these exit polls can set the mood across the country, from celebration, shock to disappointment, and hours of political speculation over what is going to be next. And it's important to say that these exit polls show how many Knesset seats each party might receive. It's not the official results yet. But it is something really meaningful that a lot of Israelis are sitting together, families in front of the TV, and it's kind of a clue of what's going to happen next. So I will say, especially this year, I will imagine a lot of rating at 10 p.m. at night for all the Israeli to rush and to see what the Midgamim will show this year. So that was more like generally speaking about the uniqueness of the Israeli election. And now I do want to touch a bit about what makes these particular elections so significant for Israeli this time. So, like you said, Adam, this is the first election after October 7 for Israeli. Last time we voted was 2022. It was, a bit after COVID or still during COVID. And Israeli changed so much in these 4 years. So many things happened, especially after October 7 and after the war. This really affected almost every part of Israeli society: the security, the economy, the politics, the Israel society, the trust in the government and the institutions, and the relationship with the United States and the Jewish communities and the diaspora. So for many Israelis, this specific election is not only about, political preference. It's really about what direction the country should take after one of the most traumatic periods in history. So I think this is one of the biggest things for Israeli going now to vote, is to think about, this past few years after everything we've been through, after the war, after October 7, and to ask ourselves, where we're going to go next. Second part, and we're going to touch it a bit more in our next webinar, is there are a few key issues in these specific elections that many of Israeli have debated for years. But I will say again, after October 7 and after the war, they made this issue, some of them, much more important. For example, issues about the security and the Palestinian conflict, and to see, what will happen with Gaza, with the region, with Iran. These kind of things is going to be much more relevant in these specific elections. And then the Israel and the United States relationship and the relationship with Jewish diaspora. We see this connection more than ever in these few years. So the election will really show, which directions we're going to go there. military service and the Haredi draft. It's after all these years of war and heavy reserve duty. So there is a big question who is going to serve in the military and how it's going to look like. And then some of them, most, I will say, regular things like cost of living and the economy, but that's also after years of war and higher government spending, voters in Israel are asking themselves how the next government will deal these rising costs and how they will help communities affected by the war, especially in the north and in the south. And the last thing, I will say that everything related to democracy and the court system, and there is a really big debate how it's going to look like. So this is also something will be very affected by the results of the next elections. And I will just end up with more like, personal feeling. If you will ask Israeli on the street, how do you feel about these coming elections? So I think it's a combination between hope and exhaustion. I think after these few years in Israel, this election could be, a fresh start, and after everything we've been through, some of the Israelis see that as an opportunity maybe to go back to some stability or some kind of normality, although I'm not sure what it means in Israel, but kind of feel something a bit more normal and a sense of, moving forward, even if they have very different ideas, exactly how to get there. But a lot of Israeli looking for this opportunity to see what will happen after that. And then I will say also that for Israeli, the quote of the personal is the political, Yeshua politi, is really, really relevant because I think for many Israeli politics feels deeply personal. Almost everyone knows someone who has been directly affected by these few years. Someone who served in the reserves, or someone who evacuated from their home, someone who lost loved one, or someone whose business was affected. So a lot of Israeli asking themselves, on the day after the election, how this exactly will look like and how people will treat these issues. And just to wrap up this part, I think that, mainly for Israelis, this election is about the question of what kind of Israeli do we want to build after October 7, which direction we want, the country to go after everything we've been through. So with that, I will also pass it to Adam to talk a bit about why these specific elections are so important for the Jewish community.
Thanks, Hila. And I have to say, I'm so honored to be on with both of you because, just listening to both of you, I've already learned a lot. And I want to actually, Hila, you mentioned, how the personal is political, and we all really we know someone who has, been impacted and affected by this war by the last few years, whether it's really, friends or colleagues or people that have been killed or injured or affected economically. So yeah, these elections are definitely, deeply personal to all of us. Yeah, so we've talked about how the system works, and Dean addressed that, and Hila, you've mentioned a little bit how Israelis are going into these elections. I want to really try to focus maybe on the question, how do these Israeli elections, what do they mean for those of us who aren't voting, for the American Jewish community? It's obvious, that American Jews are not going to vote on October 27th, but for many of us here in the U.S., Israel really isn't simply another country that we, follow in the news. It's connected to our Jewish identity, to our families, to our communities, really to our understanding of Jewish life. And, furthermore, I'm always taken back to the saying that says what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in Israel definitely does not stay in Israel. And, while, Israelis are going to the polls and deciding what kind of government they want, their decisions ultimately, impact the Jewish community here. So I want to spend a few minutes thinking about, what the election might mean for us. And I would like to try to make 4 points here. The first point I want to make here is that, Israel is personal. For many American Jews, there's a deep, deep connection. It might be family that lives in Israel. It might be a trip. children who live in Israel. It could be through a synagogue or camp connection, or simply the feeling that Israel is an important part of our Jewish story and Jewish identity. But with that, there isn't one American-Jewish relationship with Israel. Some people feel an incredibly strong connection. Others feel more distant. Some people agree with Israeli policies and Israeli government, and others disagree. And many of us, fall somewhere in between. And I think that is very important for us to recognize, because when we talk about what an Israeli election means for American Jews, there isn't going to be one American Jewish reaction to any outcome or results that happen after the elections. So that's point number one. The second point I want to make is that Israel is part of our civic environment here, especially here in the DC area. And I have to say, we have members of Congress, thinking about Israel and the Middle East. We have administration officials, we have diplomats, we have journalists, interfaith partners, think tanks, universities, Jewish organizations that, we all engage in this conversation about Israel every day. And those conversations, they don't stay in the office. They come back into our communities. They happen in our synagogues. They happen in our schools, on college campuses, in our workplaces. And they happen, when a friend or a colleague, comes up to us and asks us, what do you think about what's happening in Israel? What do you think about what Israel just did? And over the past few years, these conversations can be, have become a little bit, sometimes at times challenging and complicated. So, for our community, understanding Israeli society and Israeli politics isn't just about, knowing what's happening there. It's also, it helps us navigate our own conversations here at home. The third point I'm going to make is that the relationship between Israel and American Jewry, it's more than just a government-to-government relationship. When we talk about the U.S.-Israel relationship, we often think about, presidents, prime ministers, Congress, foreign policy experts. But the relationship between Israelis and American Jews, in my mind, is as important, if not more. American Jews are not simply, observers. We have family there. Again, we have an interest. We visit there often. We send our kids there, and we support organizations that work in Israel. And in turn, it's as important. Israel is an important part of our, American Jewish communal life here. So one of the things that I know I'll be watching after this election isn't just, the political relationship between the two governments, but what the relationship between Israel and Israelis and American Jewry looks like after these elections. Will American Jews continue to feel connected to Israel? Will Israelis understand the diversity of American Jewish life? And how do we, maintain that relationship even when we don't always see eye to eye and we don't always see things in the same way? And the last point I want to make here is that, what do these elections mean to us? How do we stay engaged in this? And I think there's a few things we can do also as the American Jewish community, regardless of, who ultimately wins the elections. The first thing is, of course, learn. We can understand Israeli society better. We can understand the electoral system better. And I think hopefully today and this series will, allow us to do that learning part. The second thing is listen. I think, we are able here to take a step back at times and hear from different perspectives, living on the ground, whether it's Israelis, Arabs, Druze, religious, secular Jews, all who have different experiences and perspectives. And I think it's important for us to understand that diversity of the way, we think and feel about things happening in Israel exists not only here within, the American Jewish community, but even more within Israel. There's a lot of diversity of opinions within Israel. And also continue engaging. We have to continue these conversations, even when they're challenging and at times complicated, with our elected officials, with our neighbors, with our interfaith partners, with our colleagues, and within our own, Jewish community. And I think bringing this all together, maintaining a relationship with Israel, a connection that is, that is strong enough to allow for both connection and at times disagreement. but it's not a binary relationship. It's not, you either disagree or feel connected. We are able to have this space and the nuance to hold both of these realities together at times. And if we are able to navigate, within this environment, our community will be stronger for it, Israel will be stronger, and our relationship will be stronger. And I'll end on one personal note here. And, I grew up in Israel. Israel is obviously very important to me. And of course, I've spent now a few years building, my life here in the United States as well. So I've, seen this relationship from both sides. And I think, that is exactly why I think when this election is over, I don't think the only question is about who won. I think it's more about watching how the new government, regardless of who it is, thinks about its relationship with American Jews. And, does it see American Jewish communities as an important partner? Does it understand that the Jewish community in the United States is, very diverse and has its own experiences and challenges as well? And I think, we need to find a way to nurture this relationship, regardless of whether we agree or disagree on, a variety of different topics. So with that, I'm gonna stop here and pause. And I want to we're going to get into Q&A in a bit. I just want to bring Hila and Dean back into the conversation. And, I'm going to connect a little bit of what I talked about and bring Hila and Dean in. And Hila, you talked a little bit about, the ordinary Israelis and what they're thinking, when they're going to vote now. Do you think, Israelis think about what American Jews, want and think about when they go to the polls? Or is that, generally not something on people's mind, when they go to vote?
Thank you, Adam. So I think it's a really good question. And I think, to be fair, maybe things have been changed a bit in these few years. I will say that if you will ask, an average Israeli a few years ago, if he thinks about that when he go to vote, I'm not sure if the answer will be yes. I think when Israelis are going to vote, they primarily think about, the internal issues happening in Israel, and they're thinking about their daily life. But I think in the past few years, after October 7 and after the war and everything happened, and especially with the United States partnership with Israel, I guess now for a lot of Israelis, it is something that they're thinking about. I'm not convinced if it will change, a voting for the Israelis, but I think this coming election, it is something that people are thinking about, and hopefully it's something that will be increasing, and hopefully, people will understand this partnership is important. So I will say, yes, it's changed over the years, and it's need maybe to be a bit more than before.
Yeah, Dean, you have anything you want to add?
I couldn't disagree with you on that one. I think the relationship should change, continues to change all the time. But if I spent the last year looking in retrospective about my trip. I was there 1 year before October 7th, and then 2 years afterwards. And I've seen how, let's say, how Americans view Israel. The approach changes. And now come back to Israel and see how Israelis' approach has changed towards the American truth. And I'll start from the end, and I'll say that I'm optimistic. That's something that might sound surprising or rare, but I'll say this. In the past year, I've spent more than 6 months of it in reserves, 3 months in Gaza and 3 months in Lebanon, and I couldn't be more happier to be in Israel. Now, when people ask me why is that, I say that when we returned from the Shlichut to Israel, I was excited. I was excited for a couple of things. One, the amount of support that I've seen here, or if I can say it more drastically, the change in the approach between my first year of Shlichut and the second and the third year of Shlichut, how that drastically changed for the communities. I can remember, in my first year of Shlichut, challenging and battling my way through congregations or institutions to try and talk about anything related to Israel, to have to talk about Israel and want to have an Israeli who can explain things. I saw the amount of support that this specific community had for Israel, for us, even as the members of the community. And I couldn't be more motivated to share that back home. And from the other perspective, I think Israelis felt left out after October 7th, felt neglected. And those who were exposed to the huge efforts of the global Jewry, of the communities, understood how big that connection is, how important it is, how deep it is. And looking at what is happening on the ground now in Israel, both in reserves and now working with 18-year-olds who are practicing leadership, and talking to people on the street, there's two things that you hear. One, there is big frustration regarding all of the elected officials. There is a frustration from all sides of the political map. And there's hope for change. And those are things that I'm optimistic about. Now, when you look at social changes or social movement in Israel, usually it doesn't start from the top. It doesn't start from the elected officials, it doesn't come from the government, it comes from the ground. And what I see on the ground now makes me optimistic. Not necessarily if it's going to be reflected in these elections or not, but I see a social change in Israel that wants to be more, wants to be different, wants to be more connected. People who are frustrated with the polarity that was involving us. And people understand that there's more to Israel for Israelis alone, that there's a bigger Jewish world out there, and that two different worlds should be connected. And if I can add in statistically, after huge times of distress comes growth. And I hope that that growth comes soon. And if you look at Jewish history, despite all of our troubles and horrors, we're still here. So those two things, in addition to what I see on the ground, the different changes I see in different programs, and if I look specifically at where I work right now, which is in the Gaza envelope, the amount of growth and development you see here is incredible. People are thriving for more, thriving to do something meaningful, thriving to connect with people that they disagree with. There are extremists on both sides. They don't want to talk to each other, but those are not the majority. And I think it's also important to mention the differences between the Israeli government and Israel. So from that perspective, I'm optimistic about that relationship between us here and you there. And I'm also not necessarily optimistic about what the results of the election is going to be. I'm not sure that they're reflecting the change that is actually happening. Maybe that will take longer to happen, to gain physical mass in the political world. But as you look at Israeli history, that always has been the case. It starts from the bottom and slowly trickles up. I hope that will be the case here, but so far, I'll say I'm optimistic.
Great. So thank you both, Dean and Hila. And so we're going to take some questions and kind of, decide who responds to what. There are a few technical questions in terms of like both Israeli Arabs, one, do they feel safe and welcome to vote? And maybe Dean, you can talk a little bit about that. And also another kind of technical question is, are polling stations, accessible? Are there numerous voting places close to your home? Do you need to drive really far? I don't know, can you address that, Dean?
Sure. So after, as Hila mentioned earlier, when you are registered as a voter, you have an address, and the poll most adjacent to you is the one that you're registered to, usually in less than 15 minutes of a drive. It's usually schools, by the way. I've been voting in my school since I was 18, and that's one of the places that I was trying to get away from, but I kept coming back to it. Elementary and high schools that are being evacuated and then allowed to become polls. And in those polls, you have different sets of polling based on the population there. More dense population areas will have more polls in each station, and usually that is how it's being done. And then if you change, for an example, and if you move to another area and you don't necessarily change your address, you have to go back to where you live to vote. Same as in the US. If you change state, then you have to either go back to the state that you were registered to or re-register, then change your address.
Yeah, and you mentioned, a lot of people vote in schools, and I think one of you mentioned in your remarks about, it's the day of the election is the national holiday. Schools are closed. Everyone is basically a day off for kids, and parents need to figure that out. But it's really a celebration of democracy in Israel, and really you can feel that it's really a day of excitement of going to vote and doing something important for yourself, for your country. Yeah.
And
yeah.
if related to like the physical explanation what that actually looks like, outside of the school, you then have tables for each party's volunteer to try and persuade people to vote for their party. They're actually by different statistic measurements and different polls showing that a lot of people don't know what they're going to vote for until the moment they hit the poll. So all of those parties know that to position a table with someone who's passionate about the party is something that might be relevant for voters that don't necessarily would vote for them otherwise. There is a certain law that create a boundary of what that space should be in distance from the poll itself, so it should be too close, so that effect should be too relevant. But usually you would see, 10 or 15 or 20 tables with different signs of the different parties, trying to give away merch that is cost less than a shekel, which is the threshold for something that counts as bribery for elections. So if someone is giving you something that's worth more than a shekel in a polling table, you know that they're trying to bribe you, even if it's a trader or something of a sort. But that gives you like a visual look of what going to that school would look like during election day.
Yeah, great. So there's a question coming in from actually a colleague of ours, I think, which is a really good question, and I'm gonna kind of pose it to us all. The question is, what issues do you think, should be at the center of this, election campaign, but surprisingly maybe isn't? And maybe conversely, is there an issue that is receiving a lot of attention that you don't think should really be receiving as much of attention? I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts for that. Hila, maybe you talked about the issues that are important for Israelis. Maybe if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I can answer for the first part of the question if there is a key issue that we don't see enough. So I will say now, after 3 years after October 7, it feels like kind of we are only now kind of processing, everything we've been through. Only now people are coming back from reserve duty after days of doing that. And I guess I will want to see much more, focus about mental health, for example, in these coming elections to see, now hopefully we're going to a different, phase in Israel. So I will say this coming election should be a bit about rebuilding also in these aspects of, mental health, physical health, to everything, to everyone who needed that after these few years. So this is a issue that I'm not seeing enough, and I would want to see more, maybe.
Yeah, Dean.
Do you want me to add to that as well, or you want to pass on to the other?
Sure. Do you have anything to add?
So in the past, let's say almost 5 or 6 years, the distinction between right and left in Israel has changed from either security perspective or diplomacy, yes or no for a Palestinian state, for example, and economical decision, more socialist or more capitalistic, right? Those used to be the distinction between right and left. There's something more personal, yes or no for Bibi Netanyahu's prime minister, which has been the distinction line. So when you look today at the political map of Israel, which is, I don't think we've touched too much on, and maybe you want to address a little bit like the map of the political parties, I don't know, up to you. You would see that some very hardline right parties are considered on the left scale, and some very left-line parties should be on the right scale. Today, that threshold mostly determined by whether or not you would join a coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister. And that's a shame, because that is what most polls reflects. That is something that when you look at interviews for parliament members is the most frequent question, and not necessarily ideological issues or really relevant issues like what's our plan for the next 5 or 10 years. How do we see, like Hila mentioned, that we're building should look like, whether or not those finances should go. What is our economical plan for all of those evacuees that are still evacuated or evacuated and returned to their homes and still have damaged housings? Thousands of families in the south and in the north are still in that situation 3 years later. All of those are really, really important issues that when you look at the ideological, let's call it map, or when you look at the different parties' website, you do see some reference to it. But eventually, when you look at interviews or when you look at articles, usually this is not what's on the top of everyone's mind. And I'll add to that our public relations, Israel's plan for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, what our diplomacy plan should look like, how do we build that, whether or not you're in that discussion of it's more about anti-Semitism or bad foreign relations that have caused Israel's situation to be as bleak as it is right now. I think it's both. But none of those issues are being properly addressed when you see different articles or different interviews. And I think most Israelis do consider it, but the most current issue or the top issue that everyone is addressing is whose coalition are you going to sit by, and what is your assumption to the final results.
Great. So there's again a few additional questions about kind of logistical questions in the elections, and I also want to circle back to the Arab voting question because I think we might have missed it. But I'm going to kind of tie it in with there's a question also about how do armed service people vote, people in the army, how do they vote? And I think we can address talking about kolot hayalim, which is the voices of the soldiers, which usually come in a little bit later than the rest of the votes, and they are always kind of expected to maybe give another mandate here or there to a party or so. And maybe, Dean, you can talk a little bit about that also. And I think the Arab voting as well, and Israeli Arabs, I could talk about, coming from Jerusalem, and Hila could maybe also talk about it. I know there is a lot of effort being put in encouraging Israeli Arabs, Arabs who are citizens of Israel, to go and vote, whether it's through different organizations that help with that as well. Some neighborhoods where where a majority of Arab Israelis live, there are polling stations in those neighborhoods as well. But it has been a difficulty, I think, in years, in previous years, to really get them to come and feel like their vote makes a difference. And I think actually, in one of the past governments, where I think Naftali Bennett was the prime minister, and there was an Arab party in the government, it really encouraged actually a lot of Arabs to say, here we actually now have some say in what happens in Israel. And I hope that trend continues, but I'm wondering if you guys are hearing anything different, maybe in the south or in the north. Wondering your take on that.
Hila, do you want me to start and you can continue?
You can
Or
start.
do you want to start?
Yeah, okay.
So let's start with the more difficult question and then transition back to the easy one about how soldiers vote. Let's start with Arab votes. Now, there is a misconception to think that all Arab votes in the same way. There's a big distinction and distribution between different parts of the Arab society today that votes for different parties. Commonly, the most popular parties for Arab voters to go for are Ra'am, which is Mansour Abbas's party, Hadash, which is the ideological predecessor of the Communist Party for Israel, which is essentially a party that wants a complete distinction between state and religion, party for all citizens. And you have Balad, which is more hardline, kind of like religious party, Arab religious party, Muslim religious party. Those are the three major ones. Some elections they run together as one list that goes the joint list. In previous elections, they made it up to almost 14 or 15 15 seats, which is a lot. But there is actually a big distinction between those parties and Arab voters. Arab voters sometimes vote for parties who are not just comprised of Arab like elected officials. For an example, and I think this is something that surprises a lot of people, Shas, the Hasidic, the Sephardic religious party, gets a lot of votes from Bedouins because they're very socialist and they support child funds. If there's a proper term for it that I'm missing, essentially it means a subsidy from the state for each kid that you have. Many of those families who have a lot of kids, similar to Sephardic and Hasidic families, vote for those parties despite of their ideological direction as being a religious Jewish party because of their economical agenda of providing more funds for families. So there is a really big gap between what people think is the most popular Arab vote and what is actually happening. And when you look at surveys and polls, they're fascinating to see, like in different Bedouin villages, what's the highest ranking party, or in different Arab cities. Now, specifically in the recent elections, let's say the common Arab voter is less motivated to go out and vote. If you look at the statistics compared to the general statistic of almost 70%, as Hila mentioned, in the Muslim and Christian Arab society, it's more closely to 50 or 55%. That indicates that they have less of a sentiment that they can change what is happening around. If you look at the past 3 years, and I've heard some Muslim and Arab Christian journalists talks about the shape or the shift in Arab society's affiliation with Israel. October 7th was a big issue because the Arab society in Israel also had victims of October 7th. Bedouins, Druze, Muslims, who were also murdered by Hamas. And on October 8th, they felt part of Israel. Now, since that happened, instead of accepting them, instead of using that as a leverage to change how they feel as part of Israel, we've seen a lot of radical right-wing approach from most of our government officials. So you take that into account, both the shift in their view of not just being Palestinians or Muslims who live in Israel, but they are also victims themselves like Israelis, is one thing. And also the past 3 years where we've seen an increase in acts of violence and in racism towards Arab Israeli citizens increased, that creates a lot of interest towards what is actually going to happen. Now we know that that affects how the Arab parties today talk to their voters, what the issues that they're prompting. Right now, the most heated issues within the Arab society is violence that is raging and lack of enforcement towards crime families in Arab cities and etc. But it should be really interesting to see what direction they're going to go into, because until now they haven't felt as unique as part as they were of the Israeli society. Now, specifically for the West Bank areas, there's a distinction between Jews and Arab or Muslims. If you're a Muslim who live in the West Bank, you vote for the Palestinian Authority, who has a government and elected officials and prime ministers similar to Israel. And if you're Jewish, you vote for the Israeli elections on polls that are based in Ariel, Hebron, and other major cities. That's the distinction between the two of them. And those two have their own elected officials. The Palestinian Authority has a government, there's parties that are running for elections, and hasn't held election in a while. And right now there's a big discussion about when is that going to happen. And of course, determines a lot, for both sides here.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you so much. I want to be sensitive to the time, so I will wrap us up. So thank you everyone who joined us today. We hope that our discussion helped you better understand Israel's electoral system and what this election might mean for Israelis and for our community here. This is a reminder that this is only the first part of the 3-part series presented by the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington and the JCRC of Greater Washington. We really hope you will join us for part 2, which will take up the topic of the issues, parties, and leaders shaping Israel's votes. Will take place on Zoom on September 15th. where we will take a closer look at the political parties, key leaders, issues, and polling shaping the elections. Then on Sunday, October 18, we hope you will join us by coming together in person for the part 3 about what comes next after the election, where we'll look at the possible election result and what they could mean for Israelis, its relationship in the region, and the US-Israel relationship. And please don't hesitate to reach out with any question. Thank you again for being part with that, and we hope you will continue the conversation with us through this series, and we look forward to see you on our next program.